Good evening, everyone. Welcome to episode 1 of Intellectual Inceptions. I'm your host, Garcia the Gray, and today we're going to be talking about the fourth dimension and the idea of God. Now, before we get into this, I would like to make a few announcements. Number 1 is episode 2 will be called The Curation of Consciousness. Episode 2 will go over different things about what is the soul and what is consciousness and everything in that realm. So be ready for that. A date is still to be determined. As for other announcements, I would like to first make a quick sort of disclaimer. I did research. You can see that in the bibliography. All the information I have about the podcast will be included in there. But some of the stuff might be stuff I disagree with, but I included it because it's all stuff that I use to sort of formulate and get the ideas across, if that makes sense. Stuff to learn about, hear some opposition views or whatever. So if there's anything that doesn't seem to agree with what I have said, it's because I disagree with it, since this specific topic is much more personal interpretation based and philosophical, so that's why there's some leeway with that one. And besides that, let's hop into this. So the idea of God and the fourth dimension, and the fourth dimension is very complex. So it's very debated about what it truly is. See, we're aware of our 1 through 3 dimensions. That's what we live in, is a third dimensional plane of reality. Higher dimensions from the 4th to 12th are all just speculative. The fourth dimension is the one we truly know the most about. And a lot of scientists declare that the fourth dimension is a form of time. It is time to us, but to a fourth dimensional being, it's like another hill you can climb up or a valley you can walk down into. And so with this idea in mind, you can also, from a fourth dimensional being standpoint, it can always see us no matter where we hide because it has that extra sort of dimension on us. You can kind of think of this as in terms of like, say if I time traveled, you could see all the events in time, but no one can see you. Again, that's a hypothetical. But looking into sort of how it all blends together, right? Because just the idea of the fourth dimension, it kind of stretches the limits of my brain a little bit. But that's fine. That's fine because it's all about developing the thoughts and ideas. But there's no real end to the fourth dimension. See, scientists speculate that there might be an end to the universe, how all the atoms might not, hit each other. And, it's, again, the speculative theory because we'll never really know. But even with that said, it's still in the fourth dimensional context, still moving. There's no end. I mean, again, due to time as being relative, it also depends on where you are. I guess in the third dimensional reality, how much gravity there is, stuff that I'm not going to talk about today. But with sort of those ideas in mind, the fourth dimension you could probably say is omnipresent, or not omnipresent. Omnipresent. It's always there because it's always going, right? Because we're always in the fourth dimension, and like to us, it's definitely omnipresent, but maybe not to a higher dimensional being in terms of fourth, fifth, sixth. I mean, definitely in the fourth dimension because that's what they're within. But anything higher than that, it's still quite speculative. But to get a grasp on how the fourth dimension works, we already went over that. You can kind of here's another way to conceptualize how the fourth dimension sort of operates and works. So take a stack of papers, okay? You might be able to do this on your own, or if you can, that's fine. But imagine a stack of papers, all right? So you have this neat stack of papers. So you take one paper off the top and you put it face down, all right? For the sake of this exercise, this piece of paper does not have any height, but it technically does because it's in the third dimension. So you say you draw on it, and you draw a square, all right? Say that square is a second dimensional being. That second dimensional being has, the relative freedom to move around within that sort of paper. Now, again, you're drawing it, so you're just depicting what it is, But say in this context, it exists. It lives sort of like we do, but in a flat, plane surface. It has no idea it has no way to conceptualize what height and depth are. And with this in mind, you can kind of begin to grasp that we cannot comprehend what a fourth dimensional sort of standpoint is because we're third dimensional beings. Now, say it's moving around and it goes into its house, okay? And it closes the door and it can't see anyone. It can't see anything. And so, with it being in there resting, say a third dimensional being comes along and decides, I'm going to communicate with this second dimensional being. And so it does. It communicates. The second dimensional being then begins to question its sanity because it doesn't see anything around it at all. Okay, and it's while it's questioning its sanity, the third dimensional being tries to communicate again, and the third dimensional being says it's within a higher dimension. And the second dimensional being genuinely is flipping out. Then the third dimensional being decides he needs to display this to the second dimensional being. So the second dimensional being is then taken up into this realm of depth, and it can see everything within the second dimension. Anything inside and outside of the house, all the trees, objects, not trees, but any object that's outside of sort of what we classify as the second dimensional being's house. And with this in mind, its mind is opened up to the fact of a higher dimension. Now, as it returns to the second dimension, aware of a third dimensional being, it begins to go find its fellow associates, and it begins to tell them about this. And then its associates say, "Oh, this is impossible. This can't be a reality." And, there goes that story, right? That's why it's very hard to sort of explain these higher dimensions because I don't know if there's any confirmed scientific-based studies about people entering higher dimensions. That's not, exclude that for the sake of this podcast. Whoa, I didn't mean to bump that, but I'm continuing on. So it's very hard to comprehend it and explain what it, is, right? So that's where sort of mathematics comes in. Mathematics is a way of explaining things in a different sort of language. Math is sometimes described as the language of the universe. That's why I find it kind of fascinating, because you're able to explain things that otherwise couldn't be explained in standard English or couldn't be explained in just modern or current perceptions, you could say. And so in mathematical terms, in equations dealing with the fourth dimension, you're able to sort of write it out alongside height, width, and depth. And so, with that, you're able to just plug it in as a number, and there you are. And you can kind of see this. We have this sort of, again, like the equations are coordinates. We call them coordinates. Longitude, latitude, how high you are, how low you are. And again, since the fourth dimension is considered time to us, we could then classify time as a coordinate as well, because every place is a time and time a place. I'm unfamiliar with who said that quote. And so, taking that perspective and going back to the paper analogy, because I didn't mean to veer off too far from that, you have the stack of papers and you have that flat world. So you take that moment in a flat world and you put it on top of another paper. And similar to how like a flip book or like how older cartoons or specifically Disney films are made, it's like flipping the flip book and it begins to move the image to our perception, is because of just how it's stacked. And it's kind of like, the third dimension and second dimension is kind of like that. It's stacked like moments in time. Now, again, because we're third dimensional beings, we can't perceive it like that, but to a second dimensional being, the third dimension would look as if it were just moments in time, kind of. Again, that's speculative because we just can't confirm, but we can kind of use that sort of analogy per se to describe what is the very complex fourth dimension. So with all those sort of ideas in mind, we can begin to sort of, let's say, mess around with the idea of God, because this is very complicated, and describing an omnipotent, omnipresent, and omnipotent being is, again, not in the wheelhouse of humans. But for the sake of this podcast, the theory presented forth will be could possibly not necessarily explain that, but help remedy brain explosions when thinking about these things. So the idea of God in the Judeo-Christian aspect, because that's where I'm coming from, is the Judeo-Christian Western sort of perception of the being omnipresent, similar to how the fourth dimension I described is omnipresent. That'll be key for the future. So with sort of these characteristics in mind, oftentimes humans, which I think, this is for the sake of complexity, describe a being that is, just, again, infinite in almost all capacities, human-like, right? You hear the characteristics of a floating man in the sky, perhaps, or different things like that, which I think that comes as sort of as a reasonable sort of, hey, we need to simplify things because our brains will explode trying to comprehend infinite things, while it also sometimes goes to the detriment of human perception, because then we think, oh, it's just the man, right? It's, but this subconsciously can have a negative effects on perceptions of these things, because, say, perhaps in a scientific manner, like, again, the things that aren't human, like math per se, like that isn't standard language, but that's kind of like the language of the universe as described. Perhaps that can help display evidence of a higher being. Again, it's how we comprehend, and it's how the perceptions are, because describing something like an infinite being as a man in the sky is for the sake of simplicity, and so we need to not prepare, but sort of be aware of this, because we can then understand that the being is still infinite. We just have a human understanding of an infinite being. Again, an infinite being is because I have no knowledge, right? None of us do. It is speculative and theoretical, but we have to consider perception, because that is what reality is based on, is perception, and how we formulate the world around us. And so considering there might not be a literal floating man in the sky, it might be far more complicated, because it is far more complicated than that. But we have no real way of being for sure. But we can definitely say that it isn't a standard human being or human-like sort of perception. Now, I understand in a Judeo-Christian context, image of God, or humans are made in the image of God, is a very important idea, and I don't think that is far removed. I think that is on point. But image of is not, what's the right way to phrase this? Is not. I'm kind of stumped. It isn't. I don't know what it isn't. Like, it's not being physically a part of the higher being in a sense, but it's like a reflection, right? And reflections can be sometimes diluted depending on the circumstance. And I think, again, that sort of a proclamation of divinity, is that the right way to phrase that? That sort of a call to divinity, not affinity, divinity. That call to divinity is a greater reflection of something else entirely. So, that is what I mean by that. Kind of, it's hard to explain that one. But, again, what I was going with the sort of perception and stuff like that, we try and simplify things. We need to be aware of that, right? So again, I'm being again, simplicity. Just be aware of simplicity. I'm promoting awareness of sort of we sometimes oversimplify highly complex, highly hard to conceive of things in our minds or realities or imaginations. Yes, not imagination. I don't want to say that. That sounds. Ignore imagination. That's not the right way to phrase it, but that's sort of my, for lack of a better word, way to phrase it. So continuing on with this, with the idea of God, right? The reason why I phrase it as an idea and not as a necessarily solidified fact is because of the ever-changing view of this higher being. I wouldn't say dimensional, because we don't really know. Again, this is all the unknown, and I like contending with the unknown. That is why I'm here right now talking to you about this highly complex thing. And so we begin to think, right, about sort of these infinite complexities and the unknowns that are associated here. And, the phraseology of idea is to mean sort of promotes, like, things we don't fully understand aren't solid. And, I think that things that rely in the realm of the unknown are far more capable of being sort of creative. It has that sort of chaotic element of creation in there, because from chaos does come creation if sort of pushed in the right direction, in a healthy, reasonable, rational direction. Again, I got to be very careful of the way I phrase that, because chaos is viewed in a more negative light than per se. But with chaos, there's a sort of positive and a negative element, and that positive element's creation, while that negative element's more so catastrophe. But veering off that and back to sort of the idea sort of gives sort of our perception of God more infinities to be realized. I phrase it that way, so it helps, again, promote that it's infinite and not, human-like, because and God's beyond our understanding, and so that is why it is called the idea. Now, moving away from that and into the sort of key components of the episode is this this sort of theory, conjecture, whatever you want to sort of say. I say it's more of a theory than a conjecture because of the research and the thought I've put into this. And my theory is that the fourth dimension is a way to describe the infinite complexities of God. And God is not necessarily a four-dimensional being, but he is sort of the fourth dimension, the embodiment of the entire fourth dimension and maybe even more. And the reason why I say I'd rather say sort of the embodiment of the fourth dimension than perhaps a floating man in the sky is because of the infinite complexities associated. So it's like, it's all in perception. And this theory is supported by sort of my perception of the omnipresence of a fourth dimension to our reality. If you disagree, feel free to sort of comment however you can on about this episode. I want to hear from you. Continuing on with the theory, again, I don't think that a being like God should or can be quantified in human context. Again, there's this sort of idea of time. Like, what is time, and the philosophical aspects of time? Time to us is finite because we're finite beings, but time itself can never really be finite. Time doesn't end. There might be a end to the reality of which we perceive. There might be an end to our universe, but the fabric of what we can call existence beyond our universes, as of the speculations of other universes, but the things that we call reality might end, but the greater perception of the greater movement forward of time might not end. And this is a very key component in comprehending and perceiving the fourth dimension in this aspect, and then perceiving God in the context of the fourth dimension. And so I understand that this might have been a choppier episode. Again, this is sort of the first episode, right? Thank you all for listening. Let me know what you think about my sort of theory that God is the embodiment of a fourth dimensional being in the Judeo-Christian context, of course. I do plan to sort of, bring up other religions and talk about them as I learn more about them. I'm just speaking from a place of background knowledge. That's why I've used sort of the Judeo-Christian God as a specific example. But I'm gonna go over other religions perhaps in the future, maybe not the same episode, but in other episodes. But again, let me know what you all think of the perceptions of the fourth dimension being a better way to just sort of describe God. Again, it's very, very complex realm we're dealing with here, but let me know what you all think. I don't know where you can necessarily comment yet because I'm still unaware of where this will be uploaded. But thank you for sitting through the first episode. Give me any feedback. I'm trying to sort of pump in that expression and foster the creativity and wonder in all this stuff, because a lot of this stuff is truly beautiful. And I think thinking about these things, whether you might come from the same background or have similar ideas, I think thinking about them, right? It's all about a new perspective. And, I like expanding the dimensions of the mind. So, yeah, I hope you all have a great night. This episode will be posted in the morning. It's very late right now. Check out the website and check out any of the resources on this. Check out all the sources that I posted for this episode. Feel free to be ready to check out the other episodes in the future. Again, this is still, my theory I've developed, not anything I want to, put out there as a specific fact, but I'm trying to develop my thinking on this topic. That is a key element of sort of the purpose of the podcast, is to develop thinking. That should be about it. Yeah, thinking about it now and getting it all out there. Have a good night, be safe, and peace out.